welcome back, and welcome back if you come from a different stream and back into the leadership stream. I am very, very pleased to welcome Melissa McLaughlin, and she is Deputy Head of School Principal Lecturer at Arden University and Mental First Aider and Designated Safeguarding Lead. So this session will go through Melissa's experience of leading cultural change. So welcome, Melissa, and over to you.
Thank you so much, Sue, and welcome to you all today. Thank you for taking the time to join this session today. So I've just done a few contents so you can see what we're covering today. So I'm focusing quite heavily on organisational culture, but also how it links to leading change as well. So I'm going to be talking about my experience as we go through this. So there is some resources and tools that I'll mention throughout. So I'll share these things with you all after this session as well. So just to sort of introduce me, I don't really need to go into that because I had an excellent overview from Sue there. But I'm Melissa. I work for Arden University. Recently, my role has just moved to head of department, and I've got quite a few different background areas. So please reach out if you want to hear about any of this or any resources that you would like to. So to kick things off today, I wanted to start with something very basic, and I'm not going through this because everybody here understands what organisational culture is, but I wanted to bring this in because for me, it's one of the most important things in an organisation when we're trying to not only lead, but when we're thinking about change or we're trying to improve our existing systems and structures. It's something that's inherently important to what we need to do. And it's important because without it, it's impossible to actually make some of the changes that you would like to. So it's something that I've learned from practice. You have to pay attention to organisational culture. In my more recent work, I've focused on organisational psychology, and it's something that comes up in every single sector in terms of improving outcomes, improving metrics, improving even revenue, which I'll talk more about. But there's quite a lot of different things that can impact this. So there are things within our control, but some things actually sometimes outside of our control, depending what level of management you might be at. But some of the things that impact it are structure, our processes and systems, and these can have serious impacts on our behaviours, our attitudes, how we feel at work, if we're happy, if we feel safe in an environment as well. We can look at how we can improve it through things like values and traditions, but these can actually sometimes hinder as well with this. And quite importantly, our role as leaders and managers are really vital to how we can sort of change what happens in an organisation. And there's lots of different leadership theories out there. I tend to align more with compassionate and transformational leadership, but I always advise people to find an approach that works best for you. But this is inherently key to building your organisational culture, and just something to start with that basic grounding. But I'm sure you're all pretty much aware of these things already today. So why does this matter so much? Well, I've researched this for quite a few years, and what I've seen from the research that I've undertaken in this area from multiple different sort of studies and surveys is if we pay attention to our organisational culture, it has improvements across the board. It will improve a range of different sectors. So primarily, I focus on health and care, just with my background quite significantly. And in the sector, we've seen improvements when studies have been undertaken in, patient safety even, retention of staff. There's quite a few interesting impacts. And there's some figures here from a global survey that was undertaken, just to put it into a larger context, really, of how this translates across industries as well. And generally, if we have a clear, distinct culture, which is taking on some of the key values I'll talk about today, it does show improvements in revenue, employee satisfaction, and customer satisfaction. And when we look at these studies on an individual level, in the UK, for example, we see very similar trends of this as well. So culture really matters. It's important in terms of not only your own leadership journey, but also your organisation and the people that you are working with as well. So as a leader, I think it's so important that we all have this understanding of our organisational culture. Sometimes it can be hard. We're quite busy sometimes in our roles. It can be difficult to get a read on things sometimes. But I think actually we need to make time to get feedback, listen to others, and try to really sort of experience what the day-to-day of roles is like as well. I think if we can try to do these things, that lead us a better place then to implement strategies and actually achieve the goals that they are setting out for an organisation as well. What tends to happen, and I've learned these things from experience over the years, I'll be completely honest, if we try to create changes where we might have a great idea, we have to actually think about, well, is it right for our organisation? Is it the right time? Is it actually going to do what I want it to? So if our strategies aren't consistent with our structure and our organisational culture, it can be met with resistance, for example. It could be actually there's things we haven't considered or thought about potentially, which might make life more difficult. And it might even become impossible to implement if we don't have our teams behind us. So it's really important that we set out a clear agenda as to why we're creating change and how this is going to impact people as well. So just a few more stats. I like my statistics, as you'll see from this presentation today. But from improving culture, we can actually see it does continue to have an improvement in outcomes as well. So if we've already got our culture right, we know it's got this increase in supporting our employees and our end sort of customers, patients, service users that we are working with. But if we continue to improve it, it shows that we're actually engaged and we're continually trying to make this improvement as we move forward. But to lead change, it's not necessarily easy. And I think thinking about our culture is really key to this. But we are living in an age where there's lots of new innovations. We're dealing with things like AI at the moment in our sector quite heavily. And there's lots of other things that are coming out in terms of how technology is progressing quite quickly. So we do have to be responsive to change and adaptable as well. And there's a lot of different change models, and I'll talk about some of this later, and evaluative methods as well. But I think the first starting point is actually sort of having a look at where are you with these things at the moment? And it's quite a sort of basic thing to talk about, but when we're quite busy, it's sometimes hard to stop and do all of these steps. And I think that's the thing we need to sort of actually step back and sometimes look from that sort of perspective and understand, well, what are the issues that we want to address, but actually get to the root cause and consider the different solutions we might have available to us. But to do that, we can't just necessarily go ahead blindly. We have to listen to others. And I think for me, it's really important to gather perspectives from the team, those around you, the people that you are impacting potentially with these changes as well. Because although we might be in leadership positions, there's plenty that we don't understand. And actually, things change all the time. And we have to make sure that we are understanding how we're impacting our employees. From this, you would then create an agenda, so craft a plan based on the issues you identify, gather the feedback and use that as well to inform what you want to do. And then next, try and establish the direction your organisation should go, how to get there. And then the final stage is this is where you start to use yourself to try to implement change within your organisation. So we all have kind of a sphere of influence within our roles, and it'll differ depending, what role you're in, what position, who you can influence around you. But it's quite important to recognise that actually you can feedback, you can suggest changes, and you can actually put that forward if you need to. So think about where you are in your own organisation and how you can use that. And finally, something I like to consider with this is how you engage and execute. So it's trying to engage others in a positive way with change implementation. And I'll talk more about it later, but people find change quite scary, and probably quite a few who are on the call maybe feel that way as well. But it's something that does happen, and it can be quite a positive as well, especially when we use it correctly. So for me, I think the biggest thing anytime I sort of come into an organisation is understanding the culture and seeing if we need to do anything to change or transform our culture as well. And it might just be small things, connecting more with people if you work remotely, or making time to be available in the office if you are in as well. And I think cultural transformation, it can sound quite grand and quite scary, like you have to change every single thing, but it does actually start with quite small steps as well. And I think what we have to do is actually look at what we want to get out of it, and I think one of the ways of doing this, you can look at sort of, well, what's the issues, as I was saying, what results are you getting, what are the outcomes now, and actually start to unpick this. Do you need to change things in how the processes are being implemented or the management systems? Is it the leadership behaviour? And that's where we need to start unpicking where changes need to occur. And I think for me, there's a few key things that implement and feed into this as well. There's 4 key actions that I kind of feel really resonate with me through this, and hopefully it does for some of you as well. But I think we have to firstly foster a real sense of understanding. We have to understand as well, if we are in a position as a leadership title or management role, that actually we might have biases. We also might not get the full picture because people might not want to tell us as well. There's all sorts of complications we have to understand with this. So we have to try and sort of get that sort of sense of understanding of what's going on, and also make sure those around us are clear as well on what we're aiming to achieve. And something I think that's quite important is actually setting out this sense of conviction. So if you ask people for feedback and everybody tells you there's the same problem and then you ignore it in your plans with what you want to go and do, then you're not sort of showing conviction in terms of you are acting on something that's raised. I think it's quite important to make sure you hear the people around you and the team that you work with as well. Where we can, it's good to look at how we can implement change through mechanisms we have in place already. Sometimes that might be what needs changing as well. We might need a different structure, a different process, or we might need to think about doing something differently. Sometimes when we've used something for a long time, we can get quite used to it, and actually changing to something new can be a bit scary as well. But actually it can lead to, reductions in sort of staff overload, depending on what sort of jobs we're looking at, and all sorts of other areas as well. So it's important to consider all avenues with this. Make sure we're focusing on developing talent and skills. I think if you can implement quite a positive focus on developing others, I think when changes are implemented and come in, you can sort of actually shift this to a more positive thing in terms of actually something new to learn, a new skill to develop, and actually a new tool that you can use. You do have to be obviously quite transparent with the process, I would say, with this. And I think the biggest thing you can do in terms of actually making a real difference is role modeling. So as a leader or not, it depends, whatever role you're in, you can sort of role model that best practice around communication, how we lead, how we talk to others in terms of setting this. And these factors are really sort of critical. The reason why, when we look at occupational psychology, this really helps people with things such as growth mindsets and sort of setting key behaviours that allow people to engage with high performance. That's also correlated with people feeling happier in their roles, more content, which leads to them feeling actually showing better signs in terms of productivity. And we see better things in terms of satisfaction for both staff and those that we are working to support as well. So it's very interesting for me. And just briefly on this one, culture and change impacts quite a lot of different things. But one of the reasons why culture for me is so key when we're trying to lead, we're trying to change anything in an organisation, is actually this can be quite difficult depending on what's already present. So if you did a read on your current culture in your organisation, there's key things you need to look out for, because actually this is going to determine, whether you're going to get sort of good feedback, if you will get feedback, and it's going to actually be a real eye-opener in terms of how people feel. And I think people can become more resistant to change as well, depending if these factors are present. Something that's really quite important is a sense of psychological safety at work. So being able to actually feedback and actually feel that it's okay to feedback as well is really important, to feel that you're all right to do so. I think if you're in an organisation where you feel you can't, if you've got some of these other factors, such as what we'd classify as more abusive or destructive leadership as well, then it creates a more hostile environment and people are not going to feedback, they're not going to share their thoughts. And that's obviously going to impact morale and lots of other factors as well. Also, other things which are sometimes out of our control is the hierarchy of an organisation as well. Generally, if you can adopt a more flatter approach with a hierarchy, the better the communication tends to be. And I think, it's important that people have titles and understand who to report to, and all of this is key. But there can sometimes be a disconnect where if we're too high up in an organisation, we might not understand what's going on the sort of ground floor. And that's actually really important that that's not missed off either. And I think other things that feed into this is how our leaders are behaving. This is the key thing that actually sets the tone for all of these other areas here in terms of people feeling safe to actually discuss and raise concerns or actually suggest anything, even within their organisation. So just moving on, I wanted to spend just a couple of minutes on this because I think it's quite important. But one of the things that comes up quite a lot with change is actually this emotional sense as well, which we don't always talk about. I've got a prior background in counselling and psychology as well. And there's an actual emotional process with any change that we have, whether it's positive or negative. These feelings do still come up for us. And working in an organisation or leading others in an organisation, we do have times where we have to navigate uncertainty and we have to manage concerns as well. But one of the things that it takes time, and I'm not going to say this is easy, it comes with a lot of practice, but we have to start to get comfortable with change. It's an inevitable thing, both at work and in life as well. But recognising that it's actually a process that we all go through helps you to understand how you can go through this and actually get to the other side of things as well. So even if it's a good change, we might still feel these sort of feelings of loss, actually. We might feel unclear on what's going to happen next. And I think that's why it's really important that leaders come in and are really transparent and honest with why we're doing these changes, what's going to happen. We need to be clear and focused on what the long-term goals are so people can see there's a path there. We know what we're doing and how we're going to get there. That might chop and change. That's okay. As long as you're being transparent with people, that's going to make sure they feel reassured. Because when people are going through this process, when they're in this transition stage, they can feel a little confused because they're not sure what's going to happen next. So as much as we can sort of create less confusion by being honest, transparent, showing what's happening, the less stressful that is going to be for people. So try to, if we can, it's not always easy, but focus on the positive that might come with a change. Focus on innovation, evolution is something I would say is key, and consider it's an interesting way of building adaptability, resilience, and actually it can be an exciting opportunity to build continuous learning as well. And people sort of transition through this. And when people start to feel more positive, they've got to this sort of new beginning where they're happy to sort of accept the change and continue on. But it's obviously not a perfect thing. It is sort of obviously ongoing with change. And I think there's quite a few things to sort of talk about with this as well. But I just wanted to sort of go through a couple of bits because I know the time will go very quickly. But change for long-term success is really important. And I think building in those cultural factors I've talked about, understanding where your organisational culture is, and then driving change, trying to improve these things is obviously really important, not just for organisational success, but for yourself and your role, for those around you actually, and for anyone you're working with. But I'd just say to you, there's lots of different models on change. There's Kotter's 8-step change model. If you want to look that up, you've probably all heard of this one. But I just would say my key tips to this, when you consider any change or you want to do anything with the culture, think about, is the change adding value? Think about things like how the change could impact workload, not just for yourself, but for others as well, because sometimes we need to think about all these hidden areas we might miss off. Think about how we need to deliver a change. How can we effectively change these things? And do you need to know anything more? Because sometimes there's a lot of things we don't realise that we're going to impact when we try to change things in an organisation or the culture. So I think it's really important to get that understanding of your structure and processes before implementing any change to make sure you're successful with this. So just really quickly, there's a few places where you can influence change. So I've put an example up so you can see just the one impact you have on someone's job, for example. But it can take many different forms in terms of driving change, whether you're in a leadership role or not. We all have an ability to feedback, to actually drive things, do things differently. And I think this is sort of why it's key. We consult, we ask others. Sometimes we're dealing with change coming from further up, then that can be difficult too. So thinking about how we can influence change is really a vital thing in terms of how we can sort of make or break even an organisation, just to say. So just finally, we've got a bit on evaluation. So obviously you can measure impacts. There's a lot of different evaluative tools you can use as well. So you can do things like metrics, and I've listed all the metrics there that you could look at and explore. But quite interestingly, there's broader impact areas which we're not always considering when we measure them. And this could be measuring things such as employee engagement. If employees are engaged, you're more likely to see best practice. If they're not engaged, you might see poor practice. This will then impact things such as reputational stance and view. This will then impact how the community and those around you will see you. And that could impact if people are willing or want to access your service. So there's a lot of things tied in with how we evaluate. And it's actually really important to look at all of these different strands as well. So just to round it up, and hopefully I'm just about on time. I'm sorry, Sue, if I'm a minute over. But just lessons from practice. I think for me, organisational culture and change management are really linked. One's going to impact the other. So you need to understand both these areas. And making sure you get your culture right is key. That's going to be the biggest driver of improving outcomes in your organisation. And I think you need to risk assess your organisational culture as well before you make any large changes. And I'd just like to say, as a leader, I think it's really important that actually understanding what's going on in your organisation, the culture, those things that you might not see in the day-to-day. I think with anything in life, if we don't understand something fully or we don't have that kind of awareness, we'll never actually change anything. So I think it's quite important just to have that read on things there as well. I'd just like to say thank you to you all today. It's been a pleasure coming and speaking to you, and hopefully change is not as scary as it seems now. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that, Melissa. There was some really, really valuable content there. So thank you so much. And for me, you know, what I know is coming, you know, within health and social care, there is so much change coming because there's so much innovation coming as well. And we've got lots of challenges. And there was one thing on one of your slides is get everybody to be comfortable. You know, people need to feel comfortable with change. And you can do that by thinking about how you actually deal with change and what can you do to feel comfortable. And that's about taking yourself out of the comfort zone pretty regularly, because you've got to feel comfortable with it.
Yeah, you do. That's absolutely right. So I think you've got to small steps. I think if it's difficult for you for change, whether it's, you know, work or home, whatever it is, just small steps with change, I think. And I think for an organisation, it's the same thing. If you try to change too much at once, it can be very overwhelming for people and confusing as well. So I think it's just trying to get more comfortable with it, because actually lots of change can lead to better results and improvements for people as well. So it's not always too scary.
No, it isn't. But thank you so much. As I say, everybody will have access to the recording and the slides. So thank you so much, Melissa, and hopefully we'll speak soon.
Thank you, Sue. Take care.
Take care.